My name is Ming Li. I'm a professor at University Center for Environmental Science. Welcome to Home Point Lab seminar series on assessing coastal risk and enhancing resiliency. It's my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ariana Sutton-Grier. She obtained her bachelor degree in environmental science and international study from Oregon State University, followed by a doctorate degree in ecology from Duke University. She is currently a visiting associate research professor at the University of Maryland College Park. Ariana is an ecosystem ecologist with expertise in wetland ecology and restoration, biodiversity, biogeochemistry, climate change, and ecosystem survey. So she has worked on many different fields. Her research interests include the relationship between nature and biodiversity and human health, natural climate solutions, including coastal carbon, blue carbon, and natural and nature-based coastal resiliency strategies. Ariana works extensively at the intersection of environmental science and public policy. She was a Smithsonian Fellow and IAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. She has authored over 45 publications in many environmental policy journals. Her research has been featured in several news stories as well as children's science TV show. I'd like to know more about that after the seminar. The title of her seminar today is Coastal Ecosystem Services to Support Coastal Policy and Decision Making. Ariana, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ming, and thank you for that intro. So I'm super excited to be with you all today, and I'm going to go ahead and just dive right in because I'm hoping to have plenty of time to cover 3 main topic areas and then have time for questions. So just broadly framing my research. So Ming mentioned I am an ecosystem ecologist by training, but the last 10 years of my research have really focused on understanding ecosystems and how they function, and then translating that into what does that mean in terms of ecosystem services, so the benefits that people get from ecosystems in order to support ecosystem management, which includes policy and decision making, of course. So I've really focused on understanding how human environmental changes affect ecosystem function, and then how that affects ecosystem services. And the whole idea has been to be able to use science to better inform climate mitigation and adaptation, ecosystem restoration and protection. So a picture of what that looks like is here's the ecosystem functions we might think about, like material recycling or energy flow, et cetera. And then when you think about how that affects human welfare, you get to the different kinds of ecosystem services, and I'll give more examples of that specifically. And then you can think about, well, once we understand those dynamics, how does that affect management and decision making? And so we're going to cover 3 examples today: natural infrastructure, or it can be called green infrastructure, coastal blue carbon, and then also that relationship Ming mentioned between nature and biodiversity, and then human health. So let's dive right in. First, natural infrastructure. So I got involved in this research after Superstorm Sandy struck, and I was at the National Ocean Service at NOAA. And I think Superstorm Sandy was actually a key turning point in the way the federal government is thinking about coastal resilience. And so prior to Superstorm Sandy, when we talked about coastal resilience, it was almost entirely about gray or built infrastructure like seawalls and riprap, levees and dikes. And after Superstorm Sandy, the conversation shifted not away from gray and built infrastructure, because we will always have a need for some of that, but to include, the conversation broadened to include natural infrastructure. And when I talk about natural infrastructure, what I mean are things like salt marshes and mangroves, coral and oyster reefs, beaches, dunes, and barrier islands, and seagrasses as well. So I was tasked by leadership within the National Ocean Service to help figure out what was the state of the science, the state of our knowledge on how natural ecosystems provide coastal protection. And so that resulted in a publication, and there are many factors that actually influence how much coastal protection you get from natural ecosystems. The first of it is what size the ecosystem is and how continuous that ecosystem is. in a natural state, or has it been cut up and divided, for example, by roads or train tracks or by oil and gas pipelines, for example? So the continuity and the area of habitat is really important. If it is a vegetated ecosystem, the density of that vegetation is very important for how much wave energy reduction you're going to see. And then if it's a reef ecosystem, the reef crest, the front edge of that reef, the height of that reef crest is really important because that's where a lot of the wave energy dissipates as it goes over that reef crest. So let's think about what I mean when I say natural infrastructure. Here's an example. Here's a community that might have had some flooding after the last big storm and says, we want to invest in natural infrastructure. What might that look like? Well, for this community here, it might be about the fact that they might have some salt marsh that they decide they're going to protect. And then they might be remembering that they used to have really abundant oyster beds and an oyster reef, but that disappeared when water quality got bad. And so maybe they're thinking about restoring the oyster beds and the oyster reef. Maybe they're thinking about repairing the barrier island that got breached during the last storm. So those are the kinds of opportunities you could be thinking about with natural infrastructure. And what's really neat with natural infrastructure is you don't need to pick just one of these. You can layer these approaches, and every single piece that you do in terms of restoration or protection will have added benefit. So some of the other benefits we get from natural infrastructure include that these systems can actually strengthen with time. This is particularly true for a restored system, which is weakest the day you say that the restoration is complete, and then it grows stronger with time as that system establishes. These can be self-maintaining, and they have the potential for self-repair after storms. None of these things can be said for built infrastructure. These systems can also grow and keep pace with sea level rise in some cases, and they can be more cost effective. And I have a little bit more about that coming up, but they provide the most important thing I think to also consider with these systems, in addition to all these coastal resilience benefits, is that they provide all sorts of other co-benefits, and they're providing those benefits all the time. Whereas built infrastructure for storm protection is only usually providing that storm protection benefit, which is only important when a storm is approaching. So what do I mean by these other benefits? Additional benefits you might get from these coastal systems include fisheries support for recreational and commercial fisheries, carbon storage, particularly in the case of coastal wetlands, recreation and tourism, water filtration, so water quality improvements, cultural services, and habitat for other species we care about. So as I was doing the research on how do coastal systems actually help provide protection, I came across this whole new and really innovative part of coastal protection, which is called a hybrid approach. And here we're combining green and gray. So in this particular example, here's a similar community to the one we looked at before. So they might have those natural approaches, but in addition, they might be building in some other features, like maybe they're putting some houses on stilts, or they're moving buildings away from the water's edge. And maybe they've put in a seawall with an operable floodgate that can be closed if major flooding is anticipated. So here with these hybrid approaches, and I'm going to show you a couple of other examples. This is just one example. But with these hybrid approaches, you can really capitalize on the strengths of both the green and the gray. Sometimes people are using gray to actually protect green infrastructure as it establishes. Oftentimes what I'm seeing too is people are using green infrastructure to protect the gray infrastructure and to extend the lifetime of that gray infrastructure, because if waves go through a marsh before they get to a seawall, then a bunch of that energy will have already been removed before it gets to the seawall. And you can also reduce the cost then of what you're needing to build in terms of gray infrastructure. So let me give you a couple of other examples of hybrid approaches. So this is living shorelines, and we actually have a lot of living shorelines here in Maryland. We're at the forefront of some of the living shorelines work because our state Department of Natural Resources is very excited about living shorelines as an opportunity. This particular example is in North Carolina at Pivers Island, and you can see in the top picture, there's actually a NOAA building just out of the picture to the right, and that shoreline was eroding. And so what they did instead was the bottom picture, you can't see the sill, it's under the water, but they had enough oyster shell on site to be able to build an oyster shell sill that then is helping to hold in place the land there, and then they planted marsh species there. So the bottom picture now is a living shoreline, and this shoreline is no longer eroding. And so what's neat about these hybrid approaches is you do get some of the benefits of natural habitats while also getting your coastal resilience benefits. So after Superstorm Sandy, there was a rebuild by design competition that was run in the New York, New Jersey area. And so we saw some very cool, innovative coastal ideas for resilience. This was one of my favorites that shows a very urbanized waterfront, but that would be wonderful and available for recreation, and then would still be able to provide a lot of coastal resilience benefits. So you see that they're suggesting using permeable paving and bioswales, and then also a bioretention area, and farther back, a created wetland, all of those places being areas that would help to store floodwaters when, if this area were to become flooded. So one of the questions that tends to come up is, well, but how well are these hybrid systems going to function under extreme conditions? And so one of my colleagues, Rachel Gitman, who's at Eastern Carolina University, actually studied this as part of her dissertation work. And then more recently, she continues to do this work. And so as part of her dissertation, she looked at how well did bulkheads function versus living shorelines in North Carolina. And so here was her comparison of these different types of sites. And what she found was that 76% of bulkheads were damaged or destroyed, and that no living shorelines were damaged under a hurricane that was a level 3 hurricane. So that was one of the first studies I had seen comparing hybrid to built systems. Then there's been some other work looking at culverts. And so traditional culverts can be compared to a more stream designed culvert, which you see on the right. And in Hurricane Irene, 1,000 traditional culverts were damaged while none of the stream simulation ones were damaged. And so what's really great is that not only are they functioning well under those extreme conditions, but obviously from the picture, you can see the stream simulation ones look a lot more like natural stream habitat. So you're getting a lot more co-benefits. These are much better as fish habitat and aquatic insect habitat. So you're getting a lot more benefits from those hybrid systems, and they function better under extreme events. So there's still a lot of work that can be done here, a lot of really important research to help us better understand the natural and hybrid opportunities we have. One of the first things we need is more studies looking at how well do these systems function under different kinds of extreme events. How well do they basically provide that basic storm and flood risk reduction benefit? But in addition, we actually need to better understand all of those co-benefits as well, because if we can't value those co-benefits, it's very hard for them to be part of cost-benefit analyses. And cost-benefit analyses are how a lot of communities and stakeholders make decisions about what kinds of infrastructure investments they're going to make. So we really want to be able to provide this kind of information so that people can make a decision based on the best and full information when comparing green and gray infrastructure. Now, the other thing we need is best practices for design. What works really well in which geographic conditions and under which types of general storm conditions? And this is going to take multidisciplinary efforts with engineers and ecologists and landscape architects, et cetera. And it's very exciting. There have been some ongoing efforts here. I'm going to come back to that point in just a minute, but we still need to better understand what works well where. And then there's the issue of how to implement. There are still some policy concerns here in terms of it's because we've been doing gray infrastructure for so long, it is very easy for a homeowner, for example, to get a permit to put in a bulkhead or seawall. Those often take less than a day or only a couple of days to get that permit. It can be a lot harder to get a permit to put in something where we have less experience. So, but there is policy movement here too with the nationwide living shorelines permit that the Army Corps has released. So there's definitely some progress here, but it continues to generally be easier to put in gray infrastructure than green. So we continue to need more evidence that green infrastructure is effective so that we can make the playing field level for all these different options. Now, in terms of one of the things I've been working on with colleagues at George Mason University, we got a grant to actually try and answer some of those questions about how well do these natural systems work to reduce wave energy and wave attenuation. And so we've been measuring some plots at Deal Island, to basically understand when a storm is approaching, how does this system function and how much basically wave energy attenuation do you get? And this is to actually help inform Maryland Department of Natural Resources project planning and prioritization in the Chesapeake Bay. I was invited to be part of a Hill briefing last fall by the Audubon Society, and I was part of one of their videos. I was interviewed for one of their videos on coastal resilience. One of the things that they like to highlight that I think is a really interesting opportunity is we already have the Coastal Barriers Resources System. So the CBRA, the Coastal Barriers Resources Act, allows states to put in parcels of land into the Coastal Barriers Resource System. And when something is listed under as a CBRA unit, what it means is you can't get federal funding to put in roads or sewer systems, etc. So it's not saying you can't build on these areas, but you won't get the same kind of federal support for developing these areas. And what I think is so interesting and is very clear from these pictures is that when you put something into the Coastal Barriers Resources System, it is essentially conserving it because it becomes too expensive to develop there without the other federal support. And so very clearly in Florida and New Jersey as two examples here, this is a very effective way of protecting those lands that are more vulnerable to storms. And then if you notice, those lands are providing important protection to the communities that are adjacent or behind them. So one opportunity we have right now is to put more lands into the Coastal Barrier Resources System. Obviously, we also can be investing in restoration and protection in other forms of our remaining coastal habitats. And these are really good ways to be continuing to build our natural infrastructure. Finally, I want to mention that there has been a huge amount of effort for several years now to develop international NNBF, or natural or nature-based features guidance, which has been a combination of effort between a lot of engineers and ecologists and landscape architects and others. And so this is supposed to be coming live very soon, early in 2021. The whole resource will be available, which is a huge amount of effort looking at lots of different ecosystems and how to do NNBF well in those different systems. And importantly, it's been written with engineers, for engineers, so that engineers can understand what do we know, what do we not know, and what are the best practices here. So the link is there, and my understanding is it's supposed to be available in early 2021. So that is super exciting as a new step forward. All right, I want to move on to coastal blue carbon. So let's start first with thinking, just getting everyone on the same page about the different colors of carbon. So you may have heard of green carbon, which is the carbon taken up and stored by terrestrial plants. Black carbon is the carbon that comes from the production and use of fossil fuels and also from fires on the landscape. And then we have blue carbon, which you may or may not have heard of. Blue carbon is the carbon taken up and stored by our coasts and our oceans. And what I'm going to focus on today is the coastal blue carbon. So this is the carbon taken up and stored by marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. So it's that coastal component. So what does coastal blue carbon actually look like? Well, unfortunately, it's not really blue, which is disappointing when I talk to kids about this. They always want to know it's blue, but we call it blue because it's related to the ocean, of course, but it's actually brown because the majority of this carbon is stored in these very organic, rich soils, which you can see pictured here from a marsh in Massachusetts. So what makes these systems so important when it comes to carbon? Well, it wasn't until about a decade ago that we actually started to compare the carbon stored in these systems to the carbon stored in what we think of as our more traditional carbon sinks, which are forests. And so I want to point out here, this is the carbon burial rate in soils. So we're comparing what's in soils. And you've got on the left, 3 different kinds of forested ecosystems. And then on the right, marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. And note the logarithmic scale on the y-axis. So what you find is that in terms of carbon burial in soils, these systems are more than 10 times as effective. And so even though they represent a smaller total area of the planet, because of their greater sequestration rate, they are actually on the same order of magnitude as forests in terms of being an important natural carbon sink. So one of the things that I like to use as a metaphor when thinking about carbon is it's sort of like a bank account. We have a bank account for carbon. And so if this represents your annual income into your carbon bank account, this is what's getting put into the system each year, into the soil, then the other thing that matters when you're thinking about a bank account is what's already there, what's in savings, essentially. And that's what we're looking at here, which is not only do they sequester a lot of carbon per year, but they store carbon for very long periods of time. And so what you're seeing in this graphic, again, so on the y-axis now, we have our different ecosystems with a tropical forest at the bottom and then our wetland ecosystems at the top. The brown part of the bar is what's stored in soil, and the green part of the bar is what's stored in living biomass. And so what you see along the x-axis here is how much carbon is stored in the top meter of soil and then in the biomass in tons of carbon equivalents per hectare. So the first thing I want you to take away from this image is that the wetland ecosystems have far more carbon, or approximately the same amount of carbon, as a hectare of tropical forest. And so this is the kind of information that's been critical for expanding the discussion of our natural climate solutions to include coastal wetlands. Now, I want you to also look carefully at the brown part of these bars. What you see is that the majority of the carbon in these wetland ecosystems is underground. And so it's where we can't see it. Whereas in the tropical forest, the majority of the carbon is in the living biomass. It's in the green part of the bar, right? And so I think that is part of the reason why we weren't thinking about or talking about coastal wetlands as important natural sinks for carbon until more recently, because we can't see the carbon in the same way we can see it in a tropical forest. But the last thing I'm going to say about this graph is this is the carbon stored in the top meter of soil. For many of these coastal wetland systems, they are 2, 3, even 5 or 6 meters deep. Here in the Chesapeake Bay, several of the marshes that have been mapped all the way down to hard rock are over 5 meters deep. So this is a very conservative estimate of the amount of carbon stored in these systems when it's only the top meter of soil. So probably these wetlands are even bigger sinks than what this figure is showing. So again, this is what's in our savings account. This is what's already stored in those systems, in our carbon bank, if you will. All right, so how do these systems do this? Why are they such important sinks for CO2? Well, so it turns out that mangroves and salt marshes are some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. These plants are phenomenal at taking up CO2 and producing biomass. And so a fraction of that biomass then makes its way into the soil, where it can then stay put. Now, why does it stay put in the soil in these systems? Well, these systems are tidally influenced and are basically wet most of the time, either covered in actual tidal water or having recently been covered in tidal water. And so they are very wet soils, which tend to be anaerobic, meaning there's not a lot of oxygen or no oxygen present. So what you do in these systems is have very productive plants that pump some of that carbon below ground into an anaerobic environment where decomposition slows way down. So it's really the perfect setup for pumping carbon below ground into a place where it's then going to stay. The caveat to that is unless we disturb these systems. And that's, of course, what humans are very, very good at doing. So when we degrade coastal wetlands, we tend to drain them, oftentimes for farming or development of some kind, sometimes aquaculture. We drain them, we fill them, we do all sorts of wonderful things to them, which basically results in not only the loss of that carbon input annually, because now you don't have healthy vegetation pumping that carbon below ground, but now you have introduced oxygen into many of these environments by degrading the systems. And as a result, suddenly decomposition picks way up, and you no longer have that great anaerobic environment that keeps that carbon trapped really well. And so these impressive carbon sinks become really important anthropogenic, human-caused additional sources of greenhouse gas. Okay, so about 10 years ago, with the budding understanding that this was happening, the question became, all right, so what? What do we do about this? So one of the things we needed to figure out quickly was, what are our global loss rates of these ecosystems? And these are some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. We are losing them at rates of 0.4 to 3% of their global area every year. So that's a huge amount of loss. And then these impressive sinks become sources, as I mentioned. The loss of blue carbon ecosystems around the world has been estimated to be about the annual emissions of the United Kingdom. So it is a globally relevant amount of greenhouse gases we are losing from these systems. And so one of the things I have had the privilege of working on is, what are the science and policy opportunities as we better understand this carbon benefit of coastal wetlands? So I want to flag here an opportunity that some of you may be interested in. This is a huge step forward in terms of our scientific community's understanding of the carbon stored in these systems and the availability of carbon data. So this is an NSF-funded research coordination network called the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network. It's housed at CERC, so fairly close to all of you at Horn Point. And here's the website for it. And it's run by Pat McGonigal and Jim Holmquist, two of my colleagues. This is a very exciting development that's been supported by a whole bunch of partners. And the whole idea is that they are pulling together the coastal carbon data so that we have better understanding of what the carbon in these systems really looks like, so we can use it for better management and protection. And so they have over 4,000 publicly available data sets here that are available in different systems. I have actually used this tool. It's fairly user-friendly. And so I recommend you guys all go check this out. This is a huge step forward, because for years when people wanted to know, are there carbon for my system? The answer was, I don't know, unless you happen to know a researcher who's working in this system. The answer is probably not. And now this is finally a place where we can store our carbon data from around the world. The image here shows the US, but it is actually a global network. So you can submit data from all around the world. It's very exciting as a step forward. In terms of policy progress, one of the things that I wanted to work on was, how do we incorporate this into our federal policy implementation? And so one of the things I got to help work on was actually getting coastal wetlands in the US greenhouse gas inventory for the first time, which happened in spring of 2017. And the neat thing is, once you include something in the inventory, it then has to stay in the inventory. You've actually expanded your baseline conditions, and you now have to do that every single year. So every year moving forward, the US now needs to include coastal wetlands in our greenhouse gas inventory. And that means tracking how much loss has occurred and estimating how many emissions are coming from that, and how much restoration has occurred and estimating how much sequestration is happening from that. So that's a super exciting step forward. And some of the people who worked on this effort with me, we managed to get an article in Nature Climate Change on what we learned from doing this process the first time. And we learned that US coastal wetlands are a sink for greenhouse gases. We confirmed what we thought was already true. But the loss of wetlands is a growing source of greenhouse gases. And this is, most of the loss is happening in the Gulf of Mexico, where we are having a lot of wetland loss, as many of you may be familiar. And then we also learned there's a lot less restoration occurring than loss. So there's an opportunity here, if we want to prioritize restoring coastal wetlands, there's a lot of opportunity to do so. And we could try to be offsetting doing a better job of offsetting that loss. Now, the last point I want to make is that we accomplished this here in the US with globally available, freely available Landsat data, and then using the wetland supplement, which is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, put out with guidance that countries, it would be ideal if countries started including coastal wetlands in their greenhouse gas inventories. It's not required yet, but it is recommended. And the reason it was so important that we discussed this in this paper is that a lot of people would point to the US and say, oh, but you're science rich, you're data rich, you can do this, but we would be unable to do this. And the answer was no. We actually used globally available, freely available data and the wetland supplement the way any other country could do this process. And so really there should be no hindrance in any country, including coastal wetlands, in their greenhouse gas inventory. I hope at some point it will actually become a requirement. We're maybe working in that direction, but we'll see. Okay, there's also some other really exciting policy movement. Earlier in 2020, the US House passed the Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act, which was actually a bipartisan bill, and included coastal blue carbon research and protection and restoration in it. More recently, we had the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Bill in October, which again talked about how the oceans can help with climate mitigation. We need to reduce shipping emissions and look at offshore renewables more and support blue carbon restoration and research. And then also oceans are really important for adaptation. And so this bill is very exciting. And the fact that this is coming up in Congress, I think gives me a lot of hope that in the next few years, we might actually get to some really exciting new policy that could have big ramifications for coastal blue carbon efforts. All right, there are other policy opportunities, however. We do not have a national mitigative compliance market for greenhouse gases yet. We might get there, but we don't have one yet. But we can include coastal wetlands in the voluntary carbon market. However, to do that, we needed protocols, methodologies for doing so. So in 2015, NOAA and Restore America's Estuaries and a whole bunch of partners put together and finally got accepted a verified carbon standard, VCS, method to get carbon credits for coastal restoration anywhere in the world, and any of these coastal wetland types we've been talking about. So seagrasses, marshes, mangroves, any of them will work. And then I'm very excited to announce that in September 2020, we have a new VCS methodology for wetland protection. So this is called the RED Plus VCS methodology framework. It came online and is available as of September 2020. So this is for wetlands that are not yet degraded or destroyed that you want to restore, but instead it's for wetlands that have not been degraded or destroyed and that you want to protect. And you can now get voluntary carbon credits for that by following this methodology. So that's huge and very exciting as another step forward in the policy world. I want to mention some work that one of my students did looking at international blue carbon projects and where has carbon finance potentially been really helpful for coastal wetland restoration projects. This one is the Kenya Makoko Pamoja project. It's a mangrove restoration and conservation project with 117 hectares. It's been very much a community effort, with the community being involved in the growth and planting of the seedlings and then the monitoring of the seedlings. It's been really important for providing alternative livelihood options, particularly for women in this community who do not have a lot of other livelihood opportunities, but they have been very active in the restoration efforts. And then also in the ecotourism, they have built a boardwalk through their mangroves, which then allows them to develop ecotourism opportunities, which were not there before. The carbon finance has also benefited the whole community by bringing in some additional school supplies and clean water. And so it really is a win-win situation for the mangroves and the carbon, and also for the community. And that's work done by my former student, Lindsay Wiley. So then, because of my work in blue carbon, I had the opportunity, I got invited to be part of this paper on natural climate solutions for the United States. And so this paper was a very exciting opportunity to say, if we implemented every very possible natural climate solution opportunity, what could we do in the way of offsetting US emissions? So here's the figure. You can see the tidal wetlands are at the bottom. You have forests, and then you also have agricultural lands and grasslands in the middle there. So these are all the different strategies we looked at. Let me just explain this really quickly. You have the amount of CO2 equivalents that could be taken up in teragrams along the x-axis here. And then we also looked at what kinds of co-benefits you would get from each of these systems, whether you'd get air quality benefits or biodiversity benefits, soil benefits or water benefits. And so the first thing you take away from this is, well, the wetland bars are a lot smaller than some of the other bars. And that just happens to be because the US has a lot of land. We do have a fair amount of coast, but we have a lot of land in the internal part of the US. And so as a result, when it comes to all the different opportunities, we have far more opportunities to do reforestation and better natural forest management, or urban reforestation, for example, or avoided grassland conversion and cover crops, and other opportunities that will provide more benefit. But I want to point out that tidal restoration, peatland restoration, avoided seagrass loss, and seagrass restoration are definitely also important components of what the US can be doing. And for coastal states, this might actually represent some of the biggest opportunities. So we can get to 1.2 petagrams of CO2 equivalents that we can take up if we implement all of these best practices. But what does that mean? 1.2 petagrams? That just sounds like, I don't know, a big number that I can't put my mind around. Right, so that represents about 20% of the US net emissions every year. I found this number very exciting and encouraging because combined with more energy efficiency and reductions in the use of energy, this means that we have a lot of opportunities by better managing our natural systems to be able to store carbon. So reforestation and urban reforestation, for example, and cover crops and things we already know are good for the environment, this is going to have a climate benefit as well. So this I find very encouraging and exciting. However, we aren't implementing most of these right now, not at a large scale. So there's a ton of work left yet to actually take this to action. Okay, I just wanted to point out this was a similar analysis that I was not involved with, but done for the global community. And actually on a global scale, wetlands play a slightly bigger role. And that's mostly because unfortunately we have lost more coastal wetlands in other places in the world. And so there's an even bigger opportunity for restoration and reduced impacts. All right, so protecting blue carbon means protecting the entire ecosystem, right? You cannot have these soils functioning properly and these plant communities functioning properly if you don't protect the whole ecosystem. And when we protect the whole ecosystem, we get a whole host of other co-benefits, which is super exciting, like recreation and really important habitat and the coastal resilience benefit I mentioned earlier. And so I really see coastal blue carbon as this triple win because you get mitigation, you get adaptation, and you get conservation when you are working on coastal blue carbon. All right, I want to just wrap up with a little bit of a tidbit on my work on nature and biodiversity and human health. So it used to be that biodiversity conservation focused on reasons for conserving biodiversity that were things like intrinsic value, provisioning of food and medicines, climate regulation. And I think all of those values are great, very good, and definitely important. But I would also argue they haven't been enough to slow what is an incredibly rapid rate of habitat destruction around the world. So I am excited to be learning that there is yet another reason that is directly connected to human well-being to be protecting biodiversity around the world. And that is that there's new evidence, fairly new evidence, suggesting that there are important connections between biodiversity and human health and well-being. So when I'm talking about human health and well-being, I'm using a definition like the World Health Organization's definition, which is a state of physical and mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So I set out with some colleagues to ask some synthesis questions in this space. The first question was, is there convincing evidence that experiencing more natural settings can improve psychological and physical health? The second was, does exposure to biodiverse nature result in measurable health responses? In other words, does it matter what kind of nature you're experiencing? Can you just walk through a grass field? Or is it really important to have other dimensions to that system? Do you need to experience trees? Or if you're at the coast, is it helpful to experience a diversity of coastal habitats, for example? And then the third question was, can biodiversity provide humans and animals protection from allergic and inflammatory diseases? And this is in a publication available on my website. If you have any trouble finding it, feel free to email me. My website will be on the last slide. Due to time, I could give an entire hour on this topic. So due to time, I'm just going to short circuit this and say the answers to questions 1 and 2 are yes and yes. So diving into question 3, I find this one really interesting. There is evidence that biodiverse nature can help prevent things like allergies and asthma, some types of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, some types of obesity, and some cancers. So I want to dive just a little bit deeper into the allergies piece of this. So for quite a while, the medical field actually thought that allergies developed as a result of people experiencing too much bad stuff in the environment, right? Nasty stuff. And so we had this whole proliferation of antibacterial products for everything, right? Interestingly, the medical community has done a complete 180 on this. And now they're beginning to understand that allergies are actually typically the result of not being exposed to enough stuff in our environment, which leads to our bodies not being able to distinguish well between what's harmful to us and what's good for us or not harmful. And so it's really important that kids in particular with developing immune systems, but all of us actually experience a wide diversity of the microbial environment out there so that our immune systems develop properly and can function well. So this is known as the biodiversity or hygiene or old friends hypothesis. And the idea is that during our evolution as humans, we were exposed to all sorts of nasty things, helminths and ectoparasites like fleas and lice, things like salmonella and hepatitis, the microbiota of other humans, and then also the microbiota of the natural environment and other animals. Well, in our modern day situation where many of us live in urban settings, we are not exposed to many of these things anymore. And I'm going to freely admit, I'm very happy that I don't have lice and fleas, and that we're not exposed to salmonella really regularly, right? These are good things. But at the same time, what it means is that we are even more dependent on the exposure to the microbiota of other humans and the natural environment in order for our bodies to figure out how to properly function. And when I say properly function, I mean our bodies actually have to learn how to not attack ourselves, otherwise you have autoimmune issues. We also have to learn not to attack harmless molecules like pollen and our gut contents. And so we need that exposure to be able to basically develop a healthy immune system. So I'm going to just focus on one example study that we covered in this big synthesis. It's a study in Finland of adolescents, and they used one small community and they sampled every adolescent in the community. They analyzed the land use types within a 3-kilometer radius of those adolescents' homes. And then they looked at the kids and said, okay, we have kids with allergies and we have kids without. And what they found were that the kids with allergies had a lower diversity of habitats in that 3-kilometer radius. And they also had fewer kinds of what are called gram-negative gamma proteobacteria on their skin. And these kinds of bacteria have an allergy protective effect. So these kids that were living in a lower diversity habitat area had that effect on themselves. They did not have as many of these allergy protective bacteria on their skin. And so the conclusion of this study was that that loss of contact with the diverse natural world can make us sick. So a colleague of mine, Paul Sandifer, and I decided to dive just a little deeper into what do we know specifically about wetlands and coastal environments when it comes to human health. The answer is not a lot. This is an area ripe for research. But we were able to come up with some interesting findings. So for example, there's a bacterial community, and in the anaerobic soils of Sapelo Island, Georgia, they sampled the bacteria there. And what they found is that the diversity is similar to a terrestrial environment, but it had a very unique composition in the soils. And in fact, there were bacteria that included representatives of Firmicutes and Bacteroidetes, which are some of the bacterial groups to which exposure is negatively associated with allergic reactions. So this is a tantalizing tidbit that exposure to wetland soils might actually have a very beneficial health effect. So we need to develop and test hypotheses about wetland microbial diversity and health protective benefits to people. Then there's another study that was published in Science a few years ago looking at seagrass and disease prevention. And it was very interesting. It was a bunch of divers who were going out and they were actually sampling coral reefs, but they couldn't figure out why sometimes they came out of the water and a whole bunch of them got sick after sampling in these coral reefs. And sometimes they came out of the water and they were fine. And so what they started to try and look at was what is different between these different coral reefs. And what they found was that the coral reefs adjacent to seagrasses, there was a 50% reduction in the abundance of potential bacterial pathogens causing the diseases in both humans, and it could result in marine organisms when the seagrasses were present. And 2 of the 5 global coral diseases were significantly reduced in corals adjacent to seagrasses. So this, again, very tantalizing about disease prevention and wetlands. Do other wetlands help reduce disease risk? And if so, how and what kinds of diseases? So again, an area ripe for research, really exciting opportunities here. The last thing I want to mention here is that I was involved in an effort to get started at University of Maryland College Park, what we're calling Nature RX at UMD. So the Nature RX, or prescription, right? Nature prescription. And the whole idea is that this is a very exciting opportunity to capitalize on what we know about nature exposure and human health, and to try to increase student and staff and faculty time outside using the green spaces on and around campus. There's also a really exciting opportunity that we haven't really had a chance to capitalize on about measuring the impact of nature exposure on mental and physical health. So we could actually be doing even more to study the impacts of this effort at UMD. And I just want to mention there could be an opportunity to broaden this to all University of Maryland campuses. There are a few other campuses in the US already that have Nature RX programs. And so this is a growing movement, and I think it's very exciting. So with that, I'm going to wrap up so we have time for questions, but I hope you see that there are really tons of opportunities to leverage our understanding of ecosystems and ecosystem services to support coastal policy and decision making. And with that, here is my website and you know what? I have a typo in my email. Let me fix that for you. There is no hyphen here. That's my fault. There we go. That is my email address and my website. Please contact me if you have follow-up questions. And as I mentioned, most of my publications are available on that website. But email me if you're having any trouble finding a publication you want to see. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Ariana, that was a great talk, and it's so informative. People already asked for recording of the seminar, so they can watch again and again. I had the same feeling. So we have some questions from the chat room. The first one from Joe Phillips, asking about what's the state of this kind of work on freshwater coast. You talk about blue carbon in the oceans, and what about in lakes and other freshwater environment?
Yeah, great question. So there is some equally exciting work happening in freshwater systems. And in fact, freshwater coastal wetlands, tidal wetlands, totally can be included in, for example, that VCS methodology I mentioned, if you wanted to try to get carbon credits for a restoration in a freshwater system. Lakes and rivers also have some interesting work going on. I have not focused on that work as much. I really have stayed more focused in the coastal environments, but freshwater systems can also be included. The one caveat I will make to that, and this is where my biogeochemistry background comes in handy, and it's just really cool science. But so when you have a saltier environment, basically full-on salty salt marsh or brackish marshes that have saline content that's usually around 18 parts per thousand or higher, you have enough sulfate present in that water that in terms of anaerobic decomposition processes, the sulfate reducing bacteria will actually outcompete the methane producing bacteria. And so when you have a saltier system, you tend to have very low or no methane production. What that means in terms of carbon accounting is that carbon into these soils tends to be carbon staying in soils. There might be a small amount of decomposition occurring, but otherwise it's mostly occurring through pathways that don't generate greenhouse gases. As you get fresher and there isn't the sulfate present, what you get is methane production in these systems. And that's a natural process. There is nothing wrong with that. However, methane is a greenhouse gas, and it is much stronger than carbon dioxide. So if you are seeking carbon credits, for example, for a project, and it's a freshwater system, you will definitely have to monitor the methane emissions as well as what's being stored in the soil. And then you'll have to do basically an accounting of that. You'll have to say, well, we stored this much, but this much escaped as methane, which means we need to subtract that much from whatever carbon credits we should be allowed to get for this project. So when it gets to freshwater systems, they are biogeochemically more complicated when it comes to carbon and the different pools you have to measure, but there is absolutely no reason you could not get carbon credits for a freshwater system. So that I would encourage people who are interested in that to definitely be exploring that, and because I think that there is definite value in continuing to do projects in freshwater systems as well, of course. And of course, there's all the other co-benefits that aren't carbon related. So of course, freshwater systems are really important habitat and provide all sorts of other benefits too.
Great. A lot of questions. The second one is from Farah Tayani, asking about the mangrove system. Say, we know mango seedlings are vulnerable. It needs to mature enough before it could provide protection to the coast. How do you factor in the growth process of mangroves in using it as a natural coastal protection?
Yeah. Well, so healthy existing mangroves are obviously providing all that protection already. And so protection of existing systems really should be the top priority for the world in general. That goes for the US and any place else. We really should be slowing those rates of degradation and destruction that I mentioned. And this would have huge climate benefits as well as huge adaptation benefits. So mitigation and adaptation. When it comes to restoration, that's absolutely right. It will take several years for the mangroves to get fully established. And that's what I was mentioning about restored systems are actually weakest the day you say that, quote, the restoration is done. You know, you've planted your plants and now they have to get established. And so those projects will actually grow stronger with time. Those ecosystems will get stronger and stronger and provide more and more coastal benefit. So if one is doing a mangrove restoration for coastal protection, then, and if there's a community that's dependent on that system, there needs to be some very clear discussion of, are other mechanisms needed for protection? Could those mechanisms be temporary, or do we need to combine the mangrove restoration with other kinds of protection? Because yes, a recently restored mangrove forest is not going to provide a lot of coastal protection until it's gotten well established and has grown and established and made that amazingly intricate, wonderful root system, which is partly what provides so much of that coastal protection. So yes, you have to think about how long is it going to take for these systems to establish. And if you're trying to seek carbon credits, that will be part of that methodology too, is how many credits can you plan to get in the near term versus once a system is more established, right? And so that will actually change from year to year. As a system gets established, you should be able to get more carbon credits for that kind of a system.
We have another question similar question, but this time look at the wetland. You shown that wetland has great capacity to store carbon. Larry Sanford asked, how does sea level rise rate interact with the coastal wetland? That's through spatial dynamics. So when the sea level rise is manageable, sedimentation is rapid, and carbon barrier is robust. But if the sea level rise is fast, rate is fast, the marsh, marsh and SAV may be overwhelmed. So, releasing carbon back to that, out. So what's the threshold rate of sea level rise where this, the wetland seems to be to store carbon? Any calculation on that?
Yeah, and I think that's a very important question to be thinking about. So we've got the wetlands that are currently in existence around the world, which we need to be protecting. And we need to be restoring where we've lost systems. But then there's this issue of sea level rise. And that is not to be taken lightly. And so one of the things that's really important to be thinking about with these kinds of projects also is, what is the ability of these systems to potentially move inland, to do inland migration? And can we right now be making smarter land use decisions so that these systems have a pathway inland so they can be migrating inland if they need to? Now, I will mention that coastal wetlands have actually been keeping pace with sea level rise, as have other systems like oyster reefs or coral reefs. They've been keeping pace with sea level rise over the last several thousand years, but that was a much slower rate of sea level rise. And if we suddenly get a more cataclysmic event, it could be harder for these systems to keep pace. But in general, these healthy systems actually are able to keep pace with sea level rise the way we've seen it historically over the last couple thousand years. So I have a lot of hope that some of these systems will continue to keep pace. But if we have a more cataclysmic event, then the other thing we really need to be thinking about, we people in our land use planning in our coastal areas, is how do we allow for the movement inland of these systems? Because that's how these systems have always survived through time. They move in and out as sea level rise, sea levels have risen and fallen in the past. And so the problem, of course, is where we have a road, a railroad, or other infrastructure, a community, a seawall, those kinds of things will make it very hard for a wetland to move inland with sea level rise. And it's what's called coastal squeeze. And where possible, we need to be removing barriers, or in the case of, there's a really interesting paper by Enright et al. That came out in Frontiers in Ecology and Environment a few years ago. They looked all along the Gulf of Mexico, and they did look at places that are all there where there's already barriers, thinking that we could be potentially removing some of those barriers. But possibly even more low-hanging fruit is where there are communities that have planned development in the next 100 years, because you often have communities that have plans that are already out to 2100. Where they have already planned to do development in areas that otherwise we can model and know that with sea level rise are likely to be potential wetland inland migration routes. We should really be considering that land use planning and rethinking it now before anything even goes into place, because that will be the cheapest way of doing this, right? Don't build in those wetland migration corridors. build someplace else that's not going to affect the ability of our coastal wetlands to migrate inland. And then we will actually be preserving future coastal wetlands with our land use decisions right now. And I think that's an incredibly important point. We're preserving what is currently upland for future coastal wetlands. And if we don't do this, we stand to lose a lot more coastal wetlands than we otherwise have to due to sea level rise. So it's all about the decisions we're making right now in terms of land use.
Great. There's a lot of questions. So there's this question about how do you turn science into policy? This is from Michael Flynn. Could you please summarize a few key points that should be conveyed to legislatures that represent inland areas about why coastal investment or policy change that preserve or increase ecosystem services at the coast may benefit inland area as well?
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite topics that I didn't have time to cover today, but I sometimes use it to set up my talk because I think the coasts matter to everybody. Now, granted, a lot of us vacation at the coast, so there's that, of course. But even for people living in the middle of the United States who may never make it to a coast, although I certainly hope they do at some point in their life, even if they don't make it, one of the interesting things is our economy is incredibly dependent on our coasts. So first of all, our coastal states basically produce about 50% of our economic growth our economic, I'm not an economist, so I'm using the wrong word here, but basically our 50% of our economy is generated in coastal states. So they're critical parts of just a healthy functioning US economy. But even more directly, there's really interesting data from the DOT, and I have a slide on this, but it's not in this presentation. After Hurricane Sandy struck, it affected a bunch of our ports around the country because shipments that were supposed to make it didn't make it. And as a result, many stores never even got their Christmas merchandise that year. Now, me personally, I could say, oh, boo-hoo, we didn't get our particular product. Well, okay, fine. But it still has an economic impact and huge ramifications on the country. If our port systems don't function, we don't get all the stuff we want and need in the middle of the country or really anywhere. Stuff coming in through LA actually makes its way all the way across the country. Stuff coming in through New York, same thing, makes its way all the way across the country the other way. And so as a result, we are actually all very dependent on the health of our coastal systems. And when we have major storm events that shut down ports for weeks at a time, if we were really developing better coastal resilience strategies so that our ports were more prepared for major storm events, which we know are coming, we're always going to have more of those, that coastal resilience planning and preparation would benefit all of us today. So yes, we are all dependent on the coast, and it doesn't really matter where you live. It does matter. The coasts are a really important part of our economic engine in this country.
Okay, here's another question from Tom Fisher. How large is the storage of carbon in agricultural field soil compared to the blue carbon?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're looking, I don't have those numbers right off the top of my head, but on a per acre or per unit area basis, the storage in agricultural fields and forests tends to be quite a bit lower than what you get on a per acre basis, again, a per unit area basis for blue carbon. And that's again because these systems are incredibly productive. They're pumping that carbon below ground. And then because it's anaerobic, a lot of that carbon that gets pumped into those soils doesn't decompose. It just basically sits there. In the agricultural and the forested systems, you have a lot more oxygen in the soils, and so you do not have as much long-term carbon storage. Not to say there isn't some, there definitely is some, especially in organic rich forest and agricultural fields. But on a per unit area, it is orders of magnitude smaller than for blue carbon. Where those systems tend to really have a big impact then is that we have huge, vast amounts of agricultural fields and forests, particularly in the United States, where we are very blessed with those kinds of ecosystems. And so as you start to scale up to larger and larger land areas that are better managed, if we stop converting grasslands, for example, for cheap corn production, that has can have a very big impact on how much carbon we're sequestering and storing. So let me just flip back really fast to that one graph I showed you in the US, this one. Where you can see that things like avoided grassland conversion, which is that top bar in the agricultural lands, and cover crops, those have, in the US, because we have so much land where we could do those particular strategies, there's a bigger ability to sequester carbon there than there is in our coastal wetlands, right? And then obviously, because the US is very rich and very blessed in forests, we could do a lot more reforestation. We could do better natural forest management. We could do urban reforestation. And so those, because of the land area, have a bigger impact overall total. But on a per unit area basis, the blue carbon is still a really good place to focus attention as well.
Okay, Ariana, it's already after 12. We still have quite a few questions, and a lot of people still hang around.
I can stay for a few extra minutes. That's fine.
Okay, so I can ask those questions for them, because they're excited about those questions. So, so this is from Heather Matthews. So great talk. You mentioned that there were approaches to protecting coastal regions using a hybrid approach with green and gray engineering. The image you show about salt marsh with a seawall behind it, however, some studies have indicated that hard engineering may prevent dynamic ecosystem from responding to rising sea levels. That is, seawall prevents the salt marsh migrating backwards, reducing their resiliency. What's your thought on this kind of design, I guess?
Yeah, so I want to be really clear that the hybrid approach, depending on the kinds of hybrid opportunities you choose, may have shorter or longer term benefits. And so that's what this question is really getting at. So in the short term, let's say the next 30 to 50 years, I would see that salt marsh restoration, if you were doing a restoration or a protection, and then you had a seawall behind it as a way of protecting a community, what we're really doing is buying ourselves some time, right? But we are not coming up with a long-term solution that's going to last 1,000 years, right? Because with sea level rise, eventually that community is going to have a problem, right? So what I really see the benefit of the hybrid approach as buying us some additional strategies while we figure out an even bigger societal solution to the sea level rise and climate change challenges that we face, which are monumental challenges. And so we're buying ourselves some time. Now, with other natural, more natural approaches like living shorelines, for example, where more of them has a natural component and you aren't putting in a hard structure like a seawall behind it, that system might have the ability to move inland with sea level rise. But again, it will sort of depend on how fast that sea level rise occurs and what's behind that system. In the case of the NOAA example I gave, there is a NOAA building right behind that system, just out of the picture. If sea level rises, there's not a lot of place for that living shoreline to move. And my guess is that eventually that NOAA building will have to move. Or be unoccupied and then maybe be reclaimed by the ocean. I mean, I think we're starting to get into a territory where we're talking 50 to 100 years out, I think. And the hard part is that as humans, we are not good at making decisions where we won't see the benefit in our lifetime. It's very unfortunate, but we're not very good at that. And social science has proven this repeatedly. So mostly what I see with the hybrid opportunities is that we are buying ourselves time so that our society here in the US and around the world, coastal communities can figure out what are our best options, what is sea level rise really going to look like, and what should we be doing that's a really more long-term solution. And I do think that by thinking about inland migration corridors for wetlands right now, we are doing that longer term thinking. We're thinking several hundred to 1,000 years into the future and making, if we can actually implement policies with that in mind, we're making good long-term decisions. But unfortunately, I don't see a lot of evidence of land use planning actually changing yet. So that's why I like to put that into my talks, because I want to be planting that seed in as many people's heads as possible, that we really do need to make good decisions now that will have long-term effects into the future for hundreds or thousands of years. And I'd love to see more of that kind of policy thinking, but we just haven't really fully gotten there yet. And so in the interim, these other hybrid opportunities will at least buy us some time and get us some habitat benefits in the meantime, even if it's not that 1,000-year solution that we eventually need to find.
Great. There's a question kind of related to this. I guess you mentioned the ecosystem benefits. Sometimes it's difficult to attach a dollar amount to that. And then you try to make policy decisions, get economists involved. They want to put a dollar to everything. So they're probably reluctant. This is from General Galloway's. They might be reluctant to, accept qualitative, benefits. So how do we get around that?
Yeah, right. So I will say, I used to be that person, that ecologist who was like, oh, nature, intrinsic value, it's invaluable. We can't put a dollar value on that because it's so amazing, right? And there's part of me that still very much believes that, quite honestly, that we don't even know all of the benefits we get from a healthy ecosystem yet. We're still discovering benefits, right? So we can't possibly put an accurate value on a healthy functioning ecosystem when there are benefits we haven't even figured out yet. I mean, the coastal resilience benefits of coastal ecosystems, those are fairly new benefits that have been quantified mostly in the last decade. And the human health benefits of these systems are very recent additions to our thinking about the benefits we get from these systems. So I am just wondering, what are the next benefits that are going to be recognized that we hadn't previously valued, right? But I will say that having then spent some time in government and working on multidisciplinary teams with economists and others and policymakers, the hard part about if you aren't willing to put a dollar value on something is that basically, even if you say, oh, it has infinite value or it has lots of value, but we can't quantify it, essentially in the discussion, that value is zero because it's not at the table as part of the discussion. If you can't actually come up with some way of quantifying that benefit, ideally in a dollar amount, but quantifying the benefit in some other way can also be helpful as at least part of the discussion. So I have completely changed my mindset on the value of valuation, if you will. I used to sort of be like, oh no, we shouldn't even do that because it's worth so much we can't even possibly quantify it. And now I've come to realize, well, but that is very naive because decisions are made almost exclusively about finances for a reason in communities, et cetera, that, finances are really important. And so the more we can put an actual quantification and ideally a monetization on these benefits, the more they will actually be able to be part of the discussion and at the table and a real part of the options that people are discussing and making decisions on.
Great. I think that's a good place to end. Thank you very much for a wonderful seminar. A lot of kudos to you in the chat room. And thank you, everybody, for attending this seminar. We'll have another one next week, Wednesday next week, same time. Thank you very much, Ariana.
Thank you.